Why do people still need to pay import duties, export duties to move goods across? But because we rely on the import duties. The role of governments and what governments should do is to look at the enabling laws, the tariffs, and do everything that is needed to be done to make free flow of goods and services across those regions. The example of KPMG in East Africa is good, but it may not be a classical example because really when you export services, you don't go through governments and so on. But for goods here in West Africa, it still doesn't happen. And I think that's the role that the governments need to do. Why are we not able to move freely across borders without having to pay something? On the issue of inclusion, and I think I touched on it, it's not a fancy thing. We need to understand in practical terms what we need to do and what kind of inclusion we want. The problem we have today is we have a population of very young people who are not engaged. So the kind of inclusion you need to talk about here is how do we make sure that government spendings, we make a lot of money from extractive industries. Governments make monies, but these monies are spent sometimes, and I'm not just talking of one country, across Africa, on white elephant projects. We need to spend these monies on things that youth need for them to be engaged. Unfortunately, we may not be right. We may be thinking of this generation as in a different manner. They don't want to work. When I say work, they don't want to do white-collar jobs. They are very creative, they are very entrepreneurial, but the impediments for them to move on well are things like education, electricity, infrastructures, and so on. If you fix those things, you'll be shocked at what this generation will do. And I think in terms of inclusion, what I mean, the solution is for us as organizations and as governments to see how can we engage them. It's not giving them money, but removing the barriers and impediments to let them express themselves. You spoke about your daughter. It's because you have an environment to express herself. Everything she needs to grow is there. And we all have children, daughters who don't want to work, but they're very creative. Let's look at how do we engage them to become useful to the society. It's not a complex textbook type of financial inclusion that we're talking about. That's my comment.
So let's just build on that, because I'd like to actually link the words integration and inclusiveness together, because I think too often we have this discussion and we look at it through as leaders, through our macro lens. So we talk about trade policies and we talk about how do we link things together across borders, and we talk about infrastructure. I think it's very important to look at it through the lens of individuals, and that very often comes back to, I think, issues around demand and supply. And I think increasingly we're going to be looking at, if you like, groups of consumers across geographical boundaries because they have common needs. They may be separated physically by geographic boundaries, but actually there's common approaches to demand. And also we're going to see common approaches to the building up of individual skills. And so I think one of the answers to inclusiveness, as we were sort of saying, is that Africa has probably the most entrepreneurial group of people on the planet at the moment. That is what people's individual desire to improve, the ambitions they've got to better themselves, is what is going to help. So you can look at demand, you look at supply opportunities, you take it through the lens of individuals, and then I think part of the responsibility of the leaders and the policymakers is to say, how do you enable that? What can we do at the macro level, which provides, if you like, that bottom-up momentum to create, if you like, that sort of space for people to grow? That sometimes needs I think the initiatives that you were saying, those sort of targeted interventions. But too often we're basically looking at it through a top-down macro lens, not thinking enough about how we support people bottom-up to go to the next step at whatever level that is, to be more ambitious and to step up.
I just want to add one thing. I think what you said is so valid. I think if governments provide the infrastructure, hard and soft, while education is in the right place, I think we have a good chance of moving these kids forward, because, by the way, they are connected to something called the new world, which is basically the internet, and they believe in the new God, which is Google. That's the new God, right? So these people are at high IQ, motivated. You don't believe how much can these people do. Now, of course, some of them are a little lazy and all that, and just like my daughter, she does her jewelry design. She emails it to her PA, who, by the way, sits at home, doesn't have an office. They send it to the manufacturer. They get their stuff. They go to 4-5 functions a year. They do business completely so crazy compared to what we do. So, but at the same time, we in the private sector, in these developing countries, I think we are not fair. We profit so much, double-digit growth and all that, but we don't do enough. And I give you an example. I sit on Seattle University, a Catholic university in Seattle, Washington. 30% of our tuition, when we give scholarships for kids who cannot afford to go to our university, 30% of the kids are kids we support through the university, which means that we take tuitions from everybody, but actually 30% of it, it's going for kids who need to go to school. And that's happening everywhere in America. That culture and my company, how it's going to affect and create a fund, a special fund, say I'm in the real estate business and engineering and construction, and really put time to support 100 people, 1,000 people, and you support 2,000 people. I think it creates a culture of supporting while the government must be responsible to do the right thing from hard to soft infrastructure.
Mr. Prime Minister, do you want to?
Okay. Well, as far as integration is concerned, I think that as that has been mentioned earlier, we have done a lot in the Francophone zone, as that has been mentioned earlier. But we are working hard as far as ECOWAS is concerned. I think by 2015, that's next year, we have a common tariff barrier. Okay? And in 2020, we have this single currency also, as far as ECOWAS countries are concerned, as that has been done in the Francophone zone. So we are going ahead. I think what also is important is the infrastructure. For instance, for the roads. We are working to have a highway going from Lagos to Cotonou, and then Lomé, Accra, and Abidjan, 1,000 kilometers. There are 30 million people living around. If you do that, integration will go faster.
Yep.
Because since the Middle Ages, people make transactions across the border. They need means to circulate. So I think we have to work hard on it. It's not normal that if I have to go to Abuja and have no plane, sometimes I have to go to the north and come in to Abuja. Things have been changing because we have some airlines now. But if you have roads and railway, that will change things. So the finances, you have to finance that. Thank you.
I was just going to comment. I think there's a strong relationship between growth, integration, and inclusiveness. I just remind the audience on growth, because we started off in that place where I said growth is a necessary precondition, perhaps an insufficient precondition for inclusivity. But we're 3% of the world's growth and 15% of the world's population. Now, we're not going to be 15% of the world's GDP and 15% of the world's population, but we've got a long way to go. So we're coming off a low base. So we've got to work on economic growth for sure. Second, on integration, there's many layers where the public sector and the private sector interface. But I think we've got to be practical. Where are the friction costs in doing business? Much of that friction cost is in things like that BC was talking about, payments that have to be made at border posts, delays at border posts, insufficient infrastructure to deliver people and goods. We've got to work on those things and get much better at that, and that's not just in one or other part of Africa. I think it's throughout Africa. I'll give you one practical example. One of the CEOs of the major company, a South African company that does business across Africa, told me that he has major problems getting expats who are sufficiently skilled to manage the retail stores that he's building around Africa. And just getting the permits, he has negotiated with certain countries that for every $1 million that he invests in capital investment, he wants to have 5 work permits without any questions. So you can take 5 people for each $1 million that he invests. And he's talking about billions of dollars. So he's talking about important skilled people going into those countries and helping develop that infrastructure. So I think we need to be practical about removing those friction costs. The last thing is on inclusiveness. There are many layers, again, of inclusiveness. Obviously, education, youth, technology, internet, and we have very poor